Blood pooled beneath the unconscious boy's head as 6-year-old Zaria stood frozen, clutching the stolen phone. The voice on the line belonged to the most powerful man in the city, a man who would destroy her family if he knew what they'd done to his son. Before we dive into this gripping story about how a single phone call changed everything, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to catch more incredible stories of courage and of transformation. Now let's discover what happened when two worlds collided on one fateful afternoon. The scorching summer sun beat down on the cracked sidewalks of Westside Heights, the forgotten corner of Oakwood City, where air conditioning was a luxury few could afford. 6-year-old Zaria Washington wiped sweat from her forehead as she skipped down the concrete steps of her apartment building, her worn sneakers slapping against the pavement in a rhythm that matched the distant sirens that formed the soundtrack of her neighborhood. Her mother Danielle had warned her countless times never to wander far from their building, but the stuffy apartment had become unbearable in the afternoon heat, and Zaria had sneaked out for just a moment of fresh air, while her mother caught a precious hour of sleep between shifts. It was during this forbidden adventure that Zaria's young life took an unexpected turn. As she rounded the corner toward the small patch of dirt that passed for a playground, she spotted something unusual, a crumpled form on the sidewalk near the alley. At first, she thought it might be one of the homeless men who sometimes slept in the building's doorways, but as she cautiously approached, she realized it was a teenage boy, maybe 14 or 15 years old, lying motionless on the concrete. His clothes were different from what she typically saw in Westside Heights: expensive sneakers that still looked new, designer jeans, and a watch that gleamed in the sunlight. But what caught Zaria's attention was the growing pool of blood beneath his head, the red stark against the gray pavement. Frozen in place, Zaria's first instinct was to run back to her apartment and pretend she hadn't seen anything. Her mother had drilled into her head time and again, never get involved, never talk to the police, and especially never interact with rich white people. They would only bring trouble. But something about the boy's still form kept her rooted to the spot. He looked so young, not much older than the volunteers at her after-school program. What if he died right here on the sidewalk while she did nothing? Her young mind couldn't bear the weight of that possibility. Gathering her courage, Zaria inched closer, noticing an expensive phone lying a few feet away from the boy's outstretched hand. It must have fallen during whatever had happened to him. Without thinking through the consequences, she picked it up, surprised to find it unlocked. The screen showed multiple missed calls from a contact simply labeled Dad. Zaria's heart raced as she stared at the phone. Her mother would be furious if she knew what Zaria was considering, but the unconscious boy's labored breathing made the decision for her. With trembling fingers, she pressed the call button next to Dad. The line rang only twice before a deep, impatient voice answered. "Ethan, where the hell are you? You were supposed to be at Street." "Andrews an hour ago for your calculus final." Zaria's voice caught in her throat as fear threatened to overwhelm her. The man on the other end of the line was clearly wealthy and powerful, someone from a world that her mother had taught her to fear. "Hello, Ethan," the voice demanded, irritation bleeding into concern. I'm not Ethan." Zaria finally managed her voice, small and shaking. "I found this boy on the street outside my building. He's hurt real bad, and there's blood coming from his head." Silence followed her words, then the man's voice returned tight with controlled panic. "Who is this? Where are you? Is my son conscious?" The rapid-fire questions overwhelmed Zaria, who clutched the phone tighter. "My name is Zaria. I live in Westside Heights. The boy isn't waking up and I'm scared." Miles away in the gleaming downtown financial district, Richard Blake abruptly stood up in the middle of his investment meeting, sending his leather chair crashing against the wall. The 12 executives around the mahogany table froze, mid-discussion, stunned by the uncharacteristic display from the normally composed CEO. "What building exactly? What's the address?" Richard demanded already. Striding toward the door, signaling for his driver. Zaria hesitated, the full reality of her situation hitting her. She didn't know her exact address, because mail rarely came for them, and when it did, it was usually bills her mother would stare at with that pinched expression that meant more overtime shifts were coming. "I don't know the exact address," she admitted. "It's the big gray building with the broken front steps near the corner store with the blue sign." Richard felt a cold wave of fear wash over him as he realized this child couldn't even provide a proper address. He'd never set foot in Westside Heights, the poorest district in Oakwood City. His company's development projects had systematically avoided that area, deeming it economically unfeasible for investment. Now his son's life might depend on finding one nondescript building in a neighborhood he'd pretended didn't exist. "Stay on the phone with me," he instructed, his voice softening slightly as he recognized the fear in the girl's voice. "I'm going to track this phone's location. Don't hang up, okay? And please stay with my son until I get there." As Richard's driver peeled away from the curb, breaking at least 3 traffic laws in the process, the GPS tracking on his own phone pinpointed Ethan's location. Richard stared at the map in disbelief. What was his son doing in Westside Heights? Ethan was supposed to be taking his final exam at St. Andrew's Preparatory Academy, the exclusive private school across town that cost more per semester than most Westside Heights residents made in a year. On the other end of the line, Zaria crouched next to the unconscious boy, careful not to touch him, but wanting to provide some comfort. "The ambulance would take too long to come here," she said matter-of-factly, a statement that made Richard's stomach clench. "Last time my neighbor got shot, it took almost an hour for them to come." Richard swallowed hard at the casual way she mentioned gunshots, as though they were as common as rain showers. "I'm sending my private medical team to meet us there," he replied, making another call on his secondary phone. "They'll be faster than an ambulance." The conversation continued in fits and starts as Richard tried to keep Zaria on the line while making arrangements, and Zaria tried to answer his questions about his son's condition. Through their stilted exchange, details of their vastly different lives emerged. Zaria mentioned that her mother worked 3 jobs, that they had no health insurance, that she'd been taught to hide when police cars drove down their street. Richard in turn revealed his name, his company, his wealth, and his panic through both what he said and what he didn't say. As Richard's driver navigated deeper into Westside Heights, Zaria suddenly went quiet mid-sentence. "Zaria, are you still there?" Richard asked, his knuckles white around the phone. "They're coming back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who's coming back?" Richard demanded. But the line had gone silent, save for the sound of Zaria's quickened breathing. Through the phone he heard distant male voices approaching, and his driver pressed harder on the accelerator, as though he could somehow outrace whatever new threat was emerging halfway across the city. Richard Blake's custom Bentley glided through the potholed streets of Westside Heights like an alien spacecraft landing on a hostile planet. Residents stopped in their tracks, conversations halting mid-sentence as the gleaming black vehicle with tinted windows navigated past abandoned storefronts and crumbling apartment buildings. Inside the car, Richard's heart hammered against his ribs as the GPS indicated they were approaching Ethan's location. The world outside his window bore no resemblance to the manicured business district he'd left behind. Here, buildings wore their neglect, like battle scars, boarded windows, graffiti-covered walls, and sagging porches, held up by mismatched cinder blocks. Children played in the street rather than in parks, and suspicious eyes tracked the Bentley's progress from doorways and street corners. When the car finally rolled to a stop, Richard didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He burst onto the sidewalk, his custom Italian shoes landing in a puddle of something he chose not to identify. 20 feet away stood the smallest child he'd ever seen outside of a kindergarten classroom, her thin arms wrapped protectively around herself as she stood guard over the crumpled form of his son. The contrast was striking. Zaria, small and dark-skinned in faded clothes that had been washed too many times, and Ethan, tall and pale, his designer clothes now stained with blood and dirt. Richard sprinted toward them, his normally composed demeanor shattered by the sight of his son's motionless form. As he approached, Zaria took several quick steps backward, suddenly afraid of the powerful white man rushing toward her. The fear in her eyes hit Richard like a physical blow, momentarily slowing his pace. "It's okay," he said, trying to soften his voice despite his panic. "I'm Ethan's father. Thank you for staying with him." Zaria nodded, but maintained her distance, her gaze darting between Richard and the street behind him, where several residents had emerged to observe the unusual scene. Richard knelt beside his son, his practiced fingers, finding a pulse while his eyes took in the damage, a deep gash along Ethan's temple, bruising already forming on his jaw, his breathing shallow but steady. Rather than calling for an ambulance, Richard contacted his private medical team, which was already en route. "They'll be here in 4 minutes," he informed Zaria, who had inched closer despite her apparent fear. "Can you tell me what happened? Did you see anything?" Zaria shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't see it happen," she began hesitantly, "but I heard shouting first. When I looked out the window, there were some guys from Tiger's crew. They were saying your son was a rich spy in their territory." She paused, glancing around as though the perpetrators might still be lurking. "The beating happened real fast. They took his wallet, I think, but dropped his phone when someone shouted that police were coming even though they weren't." Richard struggled to process this information. Why would Ethan be in this neighborhood? What could possibly have brought his privileged son to the most dangerous district in Oakwood City? Before he could ask more questions, the relative quiet was shattered by a woman's panicked voice. Zaria Washington, what are you doing out here? Get away from them right now." A slender woman in a wrinkled uniform dress rushed toward them, her face a mask of terror as she took in the scene, her daughter standing near a bloodied white teenager, and a man who screamed wealth and power from his tailored suit to his parry. Authoritative stance. Danielle Washington reached her daughter in seconds, pulling Zaria behind her with the protective instinct of a mother who had seen the world's cruelty firsthand. "We didn't do anything to him," she said immediately, addressing Richard with a defensive edge that spoke volumes about her life experiences. "My daughter was just trying to help." The immediate assumption that they would be blamed struck Richard like a revelation. This woman expected to be accused, expected to be seen as guilty by association simply because of where they lived and the color of their skin. "No, no," Richard said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Your daughter saved my son's life. She called me when she found him hurt. I'm grateful to her." Confusion replaced fear in Danielle's expression, but suspicion lingered in her eyes. Before the conversation could continue, a nondescript van with tinted windows pulled up beside the Bentley. The back doors burst open, and 4 people in plain clothes, but carrying professional medical equipment, emerged. The arrival of Richard's private medical team created a new wave of tension as residents gathered at a distance, suspicious of the unmarked vehicle and the team of predominantly white professionals invading their neighborhood. One older man called out, "Is that police? What they doing here?" The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, stabilizing Ethan's neck, checking his vitals, and preparing him for transport. Richard hovered anxiously nearby, providing Ethan's medical history and watching for any sign of consciousness. The team's leader, Dr. Sullivan, pulled Richard aside after the initial assessment. "He has a severe concussion, possible internal bleeding, and that head wound needs immediate attention. We need to get him to Oakwood Medical Center right away." Richard nodded, then glanced back at Zaria and Danielle, who were watching the proceedings with a mixture of concern and unease. An impulse he couldn't fully explain took hold of him. "Would you and your daughter come with us to the hospital?" he asked Danielle the request, surprising even himself. "I'd like to thank you properly, and I think there's more to this story that might help us understand what happened to my son." Danielle's immediate instinct was to refuse. Nothing good ever came from getting involved with powerful white men, especially ones whose sons turned up beaten in neighborhoods they had no business being in. But Zaria tugged at her mother's hand. "Mom, we should go. The boy helped at my after-school program. I think he's a good person." This revelation startled both adults, but before Danielle could question further, she noticed movement across the street. 3 young men had emerged from an alley, watching the scene with unsettling intensity. One of them, a tall youth with a distinctive scar across his cheek, spoke into a cell phone while keeping his eyes fixed on Richard. Something about their presence made Danielle's decision for her. "We'll come," she said quietly, guiding Zaria toward the waiting medical transport. As they climbed into the vehicle, the scarred youth across the street completed his call and smiled coldly. Unbeknownst to Richard, the young man had just spoken to someone connected to Blake Tech Developments. Someone who would be very interested to know that Richard Blake himself had come to Westside Heights and was leaving with not just his injured son, but with local residents who might have information that could unravel carefully laid plans. The automatic doors of Oakwood Medical Center parted silently for Richard Blake's entourage, revealing a world of antiseptic cleanliness and hushed efficiency that contrasted sharply with the Westside Heights streets they'd left behind. Medical staff snapped to attention as they recognized the billionaire tech mogul, their professional courtesy tinged with deference that bordered on reverence. "Mr. Blake, we've prepared the private suite in the East Wing," the hospital administrator announced, materializing beside them as though summoned by Richard's mere presence. "Dr. Patel is waiting to examine your son personally." As the medical team wheeled Ethan's gurney through the gleaming corridors, Danielle and Zaria followed hesitantly, their reflections ghosting along the polished floor. Almost immediately, Danielle noticed the difference in how hospital staff regarded them compared to Richard. Where he received direct eye contact and solicitous smiles, they received sidelong glances and furrowed brows that silently questioned their presence in this temple of privilege. A security guard discreetly tracked their movement, his hand resting near his radio, as though prepared to report intruders. Richard, consumed with concern for Ethan, failed to notice these subtle dynamics until they reached the private waiting area adjacent to the examination rooms. "Family only beyond this point," a nurse stated firmly, her gaze directed at Danielle and Zaria, despite Richard having ushered them forward. "These people are with me," Richard replied, the edge in his voice causing the nurse to blink in surprise. "They'll be waiting here while my son is treated." The nurse nodded stiffly and retreated, but the message had been received by everyone. Danielle and Zaria were tolerated, not welcomed. While doctors assessed Ethan's condition, Richard paced the luxurious waiting area, making calls to cancel meetings and arrange for additional specialists. Danielle sat rigidly on the edge of a plush sofa that probably cost more than her monthly rent, her protective arm around Zaria, who seemed fascinated by the television embedded in the wall. The contrast in their circumstances became increasingly apparent with each passing minute. When a hospital volunteer offered Richard gourmet coffee from a silver tray, she didn't even acknowledge Danielle's presence. When he requested updates, staff materialized instantly. The unspoken hierarchy was as tangible as the artwork adorning the walls. Dr. Patel emerged after 40 minutes, her expression grave as she approached Richard. "Mr. Blake, your son has suffered severe head trauma, 3 broken ribs, and internal bleeding that requires immediate surgery. We've stabilized him for now, but I'm concerned about the extent of the trauma to his spleen." Richard's face drained of color as he absorbed this information. "Will he? Is he going to be all right?" The uncertainty in his voice stripped away the veneer of power, revealing just a frightened father. "We're doing everything possible," Dr. Patel assured him. "The next 24 hours will be critical. Has Detective Powell arrived yet? He'll need your statement about the assault." As if summoned by his name, a broad-shouldered man in a rumpled suit appeared in the doorway, his keen eyes sweeping the waiting area before settling on Richard. "Mr. Blake," he said with a nod that conveyed professional respect. "I'm Detective Marcus Powell from Violent Crimes. I understand your son was attacked in Westside Heights. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Powell's gaze shifted to Danielle and Zaria, his expression cooling noticeably. "And you are?" The subtle change in his demeanor was unmistakable. Where his approach to Richard had been respectful and solicitous, his tone with Danielle carried an undercurrent of suspicion. "Danielle Washington," she replied evenly, years of navigating similar encounters evident in her carefully neutral expression. "My daughter Zaria found Mr. Blake's son and called for help." Powell's eyebrows rose slightly. "You live in Westside Heights?" The question carried implications that made Richard shift uncomfortably. "Yes," Danielle answered, her chin lifting slightly. "On Magnolia Street." "That's Tiger Crew territory," Powell remarked, making a note in his small pad. "We've had several incidents there recently. Gang initiations, drug disputes. Did your daughter see who attacked the boy?" The immediate leap to gang violence wasn't lost on Richard, who found himself watching the detective more critically than he might have before today. "I didn't see who hurt him," Zaria piped up, her voice small but clear. "I just found him and called his dad." Powell crouched to Zaria's level, his expression softening slightly but his eyes remaining calculating. "Did you notice anyone running away? Anyone watching from nearby? Sometimes kids notice things adults miss." Danielle stiffened beside her daughter. "She's already told you what she knows, Detective. She's 6 years old, and she's had a traumatic day." Powell straightened, his smile tightening. "Of course. But in these cases, witnesses often remember details later, especially when they might be protecting someone they know." The implication hung in the air like a threat. Richard stepped forward, surprising himself as much as the others. "Detective Powell, I appreciate your prompt response, but I think your assumption that Miss Washington or her daughter might be covering for the attackers is unfounded. Without Zaria's call, my son might still be lying on that sidewalk." Powell's expression registered brief surprise before his professional mask returned. "Just following protocol, Mr. Blake. Westside Heights has a code of silence that makes our job difficult." No offense intended, but offense had clearly been taken, and Richard found himself seeing the interaction through new eyes. While Powell continued his questioning, focusing primarily on what Richard knew about Ethan's unexpected presence in Westside Heights, Zaria quietly slipped away from her mother's side. The adults engaged in their tense exchange failed to notice her absence until several minutes later. Zaria Danielle called alarm, rising in her voice as she scanned the waiting area. Where did she go? Security was immediately alerted, but it was a young nurse who found Zaria sitting beside Ethan's bed in the preoperative area, talking softly to his unconscious form. When Danielle and Richard arrived, trailed by an irritated security guard, they paused at the doorway, catching Zaria's quiet words. "I know who you are," she was saying to Ethan. "You're the volunteer at the Sunshine Center, the one who helps us with math homework and always brings extra snacks. You told us your name was Mr. E. I didn't know you were rich." Richard froze, confusion washing over him. The Sunshine Center was an after-school program in Westside Heights for children whose parents worked late shifts. Ethan had never mentioned volunteering there. In fact, he was supposed to be attending SAT prep courses after school 3 days a week. Zaria Danielle said gently, "We can't be in here, honey. The doctors need to help Ethan now." As Zaria reluctantly left Ethan's side, Richard remained rooted in place, staring at his son, as though seeing him for the first time. Who was this boy, who apparently led a secret life in a neighborhood his father had written off as unsalvageable? While Richard processed this revelation, his phone buzzed with a text message from a number identified only as VH. The message was brief, but disturbing complications won't affect project timeline. Proceed as scheduled. Richard stared at the cryptic text, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. Before he could consider its meaning further, he overheard a heated exchange between Danielle and a hospital administrator near the nurses' station. "I'm telling you I recognize you," the administrator insisted, his finger hovering over his computer keyboard. "Washington." "Yes, here at Island. You were employed in our custodial department 3 years ago and terminated after making unfounded accusations against senior staff." Danielle's face hardened. "Those accusations were documented with evidence, Mr. Somm." "Peterson, your hospital chose to fire me rather than address the racial discrimination in scheduling and promotion practices." The administrator's lips pressed into a thin line. "Security will escort you back to the waiting area. Please don't wander unauthorized again." What would you do if you were in Richard's position right now? Would you continue to ignore the obvious discrimination happening right in front of you, or would you finally take a stand? Comment number 1. If you believe Richard should confront the hospital administrator about his treatment of Danielle. Like this video if you think Ethan's secret volunteer work will be key to unraveling a bigger conspiracy. And don't forget to subscribe to find out what happens next. The plot thickens as we discover more connections between Westside Heights and Richard's business empire. What exactly is the project mentioned in that mysterious text message, and how will Danielle's past with the hospital impact what happens next? Stay tuned for the next part of this gripping story. The steady beeping of medical monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to the tense silence in Ethan's hospital room. Richard sat beside his son's bed, watching the slight rise and fall of his chest beneath the crisp, white sheets, while outside the door, hospital staff buzzed efficiently through their routines. The surgery to repair Ethan's internal bleeding had been successful, but he remained sedated as doctors monitored his head injury. When Ethan's eyelids fluttered open briefly, Richard leapt to his feet, hope surging through him. "Ethan, son, can you hear me?" For one fleeting moment, Ethan's gaze focused, scanning the room until it landed on Zaria, who stood quietly by the doorway with her mother. A flicker of recognition crossed his face before the sedatives pulled him back under. The medical team rushed in, checking vitals and adjusting medications, but Richard's attention remained fixed on that moment of awareness. His son had recognized Zaria, but not him. The revelation settled uncomfortably in his chest as evening shadows lengthened across the hospital room. The doctors assured Richard that Ethan was stable but needed rest, suggesting he might do the same. Exhaustion pulled at him as the adrenaline of the day finally ebbed. He found Danielle and Zaria still waiting in the private lounge, despite the late hour and the hospital staff's obvious disapproval. "I should get you both home," Richard offered the words, feeling strangely inadequate. "It's the least I can do after everything today." Danielle hesitated, weighing her options. The last bus to Westside Heights had departed hours ago, and a taxi would consume nearly a day's wages. Pride warred with practicality before she nodded. "Thank you. That would be helpful." The drive back to Westside Heights unfolded in uncomfortable silence. The Bentley's plush interior creating a bubble of luxury that seemed to heighten rather than diminish the divide between them. Zaria dozed against her mother's shoulder, the events of the day finally overwhelming her small body. As they navigated deeper into the neighborhood, Danielle broke the silence. "Turn left at the next corner. Our building is the gray one with the fire escape." Richard complied, but as they approached the address, he noticed a bright orange notice plastered across the building's entrance. Even in the fading light, the bold text was unmistakable. "Scheduled for demolition. Urban Renewal Project." He slowed the car to a stop, staring at the notice with growing confusion. "Your building is being torn down." Danielle's laugh held no humor. "Not just our building. The whole block. They're calling it urban renewal, but we call it what it is, pushing out people who can't afford to fight back." Richard frowned, a sense of unease building. "Where will you go?" "Wherever we can afford, which isn't much of anywhere in this city anymore," Danielle replied, exhaustion evident in every syllable. The relocation assistance they promised never materialized. Big surprise. As they exited the vehicle, Richard's eyes caught the developer's logo at the bottom of the demolition notice. His blood ran cold as he recognized his own company's insignia, Blake Tech Developments. "This is a Blake Tech project?" he asked, his voice strained. Danielle gave him a long look. "You didn't know your company bought up half of Westside Heights last year? Funny how the billionaire owner doesn't even know what properties he's destroying." The accusation stung, but Richard couldn't deny its truth. He had approved a luxury condominium development in an underutilized section of the city, but his project managers had assured him the area was largely abandoned. Standing now before a clearly occupied apartment building with laundry still hanging from some windows and children's toys visible on several balconies, the lie was exposed in all its callousness. "May I see your apartment?" The request surprised them both. Danielle searched his face for mockery or ulterior motives, finding only genuine confusion and what appeared to be dawning horror. "Why?" "Because I need to understand what's happening here, what my company is doing." After a moment's consideration, Danielle led the way up 5 flights of stairs as the elevator had been out of service for months. The hallways reeked of mildew and disinfectant, with water stains marking the ceiling and patches of plaster missing from the walls. "They stopped maintenance as soon as they bought the building," Danielle explained, as she unlocked 3 separate deadbolts on her door. "Makes it easier to declare it uninhabitable." The apartment beyond was a stark contrast to the deteriorating hallway. Though small and furnished with clearly second-hand items, it was meticulously clean and organized. Books lined milk crates, repurposed as shelving, and colorful educational posters covered the walls. Zaria's room, separated from the main living area by a hanging curtain, contained a twin bed with a faded but clean comforter, surrounded by more books and hand-drawn pictures. Richard picked up one of the drawings, a crude but recognizable portrait of a teenage boy, helping a group of children with schoolwork. Written at the bottom in a child's uneven script, Mr. E helps me with math. Beside it lay a sheet of notebook paper with equations and encouraging notes in handwriting. Richard instantly recognized as his son's. He came 3 times a week, Zaria said sleepily from the doorway. He said math was like a puzzle, and I was good at puzzles. Richard carefully replaced the drawing emotions warring within him. Pride in his son's secret generosity battled with shame at his own ignorance. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Danielle tensed, checking the peephole before opening the door with visible reluctance. A tall man in an expensive suit stood in the hallway, his surprise at seeing Richard evident in his momentary hesitation. "Mr. Blake, I didn't expect to find you here." Victor Harmon, Blake Tech's project manager for urban development, recovered quickly, offering his hand. "I was just checking on the relocation progress for this sector." Richard didn't take the offered hand. "Strange coincidence, Victor. I didn't realize you made personal visits to our development sites, especially at this hour." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I like to maintain a hands-on approach, especially with challenging properties." His gaze slid to Danielle, the contempt barely concealed. "Some residents need extra encouragement to recognize the benefits of relocation." The implication hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Richard observed the interaction with new awareness, noting how Victor's body language communicated dominance and dismissal. "I wasn't aware we were demolishing occupied buildings, Victor. The proposal I approved indicated this area was abandoned." Victor's laugh was dismissive. "Technically, these residents are already in violation of their leases. The previous landlord sold to us with the understanding that the buildings would be vacated." He lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent Danielle from hearing. "These people have received more than generous relocation offers. Their continued presence is simply obstinance." "These people have names," Danielle interjected, her voice steady, despite the anger Richard could see in her clenched fists. "And what you call generous wouldn't cover first and last month's rent in any safe neighborhood in this city." Victor's expression hardened. "Miss Washington, as I've explained repeatedly, market forces determine housing prices. It's not Blake Tech's responsibility to subsidize your lifestyle choices." As Victor turned to leave, he added with practiced casualness, "By the way, Mr. Blake, I heard about your son's unfortunate incident today. A terrible thing, violence in this neighborhood. Just reinforces why our development project is so necessary. Some areas simply need to be cleaned up." The threat beneath the sympathy was unmistakable. After Victor departed, Richard turned to Danielle, questions forming on his lips, but Zaria spoke first. "That man's son was one of the boys who hurt Ethan." Her quiet words fell like stones into still water. "Cameron Harmon. He's the one with the scar on his face. He was telling the others that someone named Blake needed to be taught a lesson for sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." The pieces began to align in Richard's mind with sickening clarity. Ethan's secret volunteer work, Victor's unexpected visit, the cryptic text message, the beaten teenager left bleeding on the sidewalk in a neighborhood scheduled for renewal. This wasn't a random attack or gang violence, as Detective Powell had so quickly assumed. This was a warning delivered through his son. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Richard Blake's penthouse, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air above the untouched breakfast spread on the dining table. Danielle Washington sat rigidly in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Her hands wrapped around a porcelain coffee cup, as though it might ground her in this surreal situation. Beside her, Zaria explored the vast living room with cautious curiosity, running her fingers over surfaces that gleamed with the attention of daily professional cleaning. The decision to bring them here had been impulsive, born of Richard's growing concern for their safety after connecting Victor Harmon's son to Ethan's attack. "Your building isn't secure," he had insisted when Danielle initially refused. "If they targeted my son as a warning, they might come after anyone connected to him." The logic was sound, but the reality of sleeping in a billionaire's guest room had left Danielle sleepless, hyper-aware of every creak and whisper in the unfamiliar space. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Elaine Blake emerged, her silk robe and perfectly arranged hair, suggesting she had been awake for hours despite the early hour. She stopped short at the sight of Danielle, confusion flitting across her features, before recognition dawned. "Ah, you must be the help Richard mentioned," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us for breakfast." The assumption stung, but Danielle had weathered far worse. "Mrs. Blake," she acknowledged with a nod. "I apologize for the intrusion. Your husband insisted we stay after what happened yesterday." Elaine's expression shifted as she processed this information, her gaze finding Zaria, who now stood alert by her mother's side. "I see. Richard mentioned something about a girl who helped Ethan." Her tone softened marginally. "That was very brave of your daughter." Before the awkward exchange could continue, Richard appeared from his home office, his disheveled appearance suggesting he hadn't slept at all. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and yesterday's shirt hung wrinkled and untucked. "Elaine, this is Danielle Washington and her daughter Zaria. They'll be staying with us until I sort out this situation with Blake Tech and Victor Harmon." The name clearly meant something to Elaine, whose carefully maintained composure slipped momentarily. "Victor. What does he have to do with Ethan's mugging?" Richard's laugh held no humor. "It wasn't a mugging, Elaine. It was a message. Victor's son was one of the attackers." He quickly summarized his discoveries: Ethan's secret volunteer work in Westside Heights, the Blake Tech development project displacing residents through increasingly aggressive tactics, and the apparent connection between Victor Harmon and organized intimidation efforts. As the implications sank in, Elaine's social mask dissolved completely. "Are you saying our company is forcing people from their homes using thugs?" The disbelief in her voice suggested not shock that such things happened, but shock that they might be connected to her comfortable existence. "I don't know the full extent yet," Richard admitted, "but I intend to find out. I've been reviewing our development contracts all night, and the paper trail is deliberately obscured. Victor has created a maze of shell companies to handle the actual property acquisitions and tenant removals." The day unfolded in a blur of phone calls and urgent meetings as Richard initiated his investigation into Blake Tech's development practices. Using his executive authority, he accessed records that had previously been kept from his direct attention, discovering a pattern of predatory practices that turned his stomach. Official reports showed fair market offers to property owners, while the reality involved coercion, fraudulent building code violations, and calculated neglect of essential services. Complaints from residents had vanished into administrative black holes, police reports mysteriously lost, and city inspectors seemingly bribed to condemn structurally sound buildings. By afternoon, Richard returned to Oakwood Medical Center, where Ethan's condition had suddenly deteriorated. "The internal bleeding has resumed." Dr. Patel explained, her expression grave, "and there's increased pressure on his brain. We need to operate again immediately." The hours that followed united Richard and Danielle in the most primal of human experiences, the helpless vigil of a parent whose child's life hangs in the balance. Though Ethan wasn't her son, Danielle recognized the terror in Richard's eyes, the same fear she had felt when Zaria developed pneumonia last winter and their insurance wouldn't cover the necessary treatment. "He'll pull through," she offered quietly as they sat in the waiting room. "Kids are resilient." Richard glanced up, surprised by the comfort from someone whose life his company had been systematically dismantling. "How can you even stand to be near me after what my company's done?" Danielle considered the question seriously. "Because you didn't know, and now that you do, you're trying to fix it. That's more than most would do." She hesitated before continuing. "I wanted to be a nurse, you know. Had a scholarship to Oakwood Community College's nursing program. Then my mother got sick and I had to drop out to care for her and work full-time. By the time she passed, the scholarship was gone, and the program had doubled in price." Her story hung between them, not offered as an accusation, but as context for the vastly different paths their lives had taken. Richard found himself reevaluating assumptions he hadn't even realized he held about people like Danielle, people whose struggles he had previously dismissed as the consequences of poor choices rather than systemic barriers. At the hospital, Zaria had become something of a fixture, her quiet presence and precocious questions winning over nurses who initially eyed her with suspicion. She spent hours in the pediatric ward's small library, emerging occasionally to report interesting facts to her mother, or to ask Richard pointed questions about Ethan's recovery. It was during one such hospital visit that Zaria inadvertently overheard a conversation that would change everything. Having wandered toward the vending machines in search of a snack, she froze when she recognized voices around the corner, the deep, commanding tone of Victor Harmon and the younger, agitated voice of his son Cameron. "You said no one would get seriously hurt," Cameron was saying, his voice cracking with stress. "They were just supposed to scare him off, not put him in the ICU." Victor's response was cold. Sometimes, messages require emphasis to be properly received. Besides, Blake's kid brought it on himself, poking around in Westside Heights, filling those people's heads with ideas about education and opportunities. Then he found those financial documents in my office during that tour last month. He actually threatened to go to his father with them. Zaria's breath caught in her throat as the pieces aligned in her young mind. Mr. Ethan, had discovered something about Victor's business dealings, something worth silencing him over. What if he dies? Cameron's voice had dropped to a terrified whisper. What if they trace it back to us? Victor's laugh chilled Zaria even through the hospital's heated corridors. Nobody cares about what happens in Westside Heights. Powell's report already labels it gang violence. It's contained. Zaria backed away slowly, her heart pounding as she processed what she'd heard. Ethan hadn't been randomly attacked. He had been targeted because he knew something dangerous, something that threatened whatever Victor Harmon was doing in her neighborhood. She needed to tell Richard, but as she turned to flee, her shoes squeaked against the polished floor. The conversation abruptly halted. "Is someone there?" Victor called out sharply. Zaria ran her small legs, carrying her back to the safety of her mother, and the man who now represented her only hope against forces she barely understood but instinctively feared. Storm clouds gathered over Oakwood City as Richard Blake's driver navigated the sleek Bentley through increasingly heavy traffic. In the back seat, Richard reviewed security arrangements on his tablet, while Ethan, released from the hospital, but still pale and moving gingerly, stared silently out the window. The last 72 hours had transformed the Blake family's existence. After Zaria reported the conversation she'd overheard between Victor and Cameron, Harmon Richard had immediately moved Ethan to a more secure medical facility under an assumed name. Now, with Ethan finally stable enough for discharge, they were headed not to their penthouse, but to a private residence outside the city, one connected to neither the Blake name nor any of Richard's known business entities. "Are you sure this is necessary?" Ethan asked, his voice still weak from days of intubation. The bruises on his face had evolved from angry purple to sickly yellow-green visual reminders of violence that seemed impossibly distant from their previously sheltered lives. "Yes," Richard replied without hesitation. "Until we understand exactly how far this conspiracy extends, we can't risk your safety." He hesitated before adding, "or the Washingtons." Ethan's eyes sharpened at the mention of Zaria and her mother. "Are they okay? Where are they?" The concern in his voice confirmed what Richard had begun to suspect. His son's connection to Westside Heights ran deeper than occasional volunteering. "They're already at the safe house," Richard assured him. "I've arranged protection for them as well." Danielle was reluctant, but she agreed after Detective Powell's questioning took a hostile turn. The memory of that interview still burned in Richard's mind. Powell had returned to the hospital with pointed questions about Zaria's movements on the day of the attack, implying that a 6-year-old girl might somehow be complicit in a violent assault. Only Richard's intervention and the threat of his attorneys had ended the interrogation. Back at Blake Tech headquarters, Richard's investigation into the Westside Heights development had unleashed a corporate firestorm. Board members had called an emergency meeting, questioning his erratic behavior and concerning fixation on a routine development project. Victor's allies within the company had moved swiftly to limit Richard's access to certain financial records, citing ongoing audits that required temporary restrictions. None of this had deterred Richard, who now operated with the single-minded focus that had built his technology empire. He had dispatched a trusted security team to secure all records related to the Westside Heights project before they could be destroyed. While Ethan recovered, and the Washingtons adjusted to their temporary sanctuary, Richard pursued two parallel investigations. The first, conducted through official channels, proceeded slowly against the headwinds of institutional resistance. The second, leveraging resources few knew he possessed, advanced more rapidly through shadows and whispers. It was through this unofficial network that Richard received a cryptic message from Zaria's teacher, Miss Coleman. Found what E was looking for. Not safe to talk. Will send proof when secure. Before they could arrange a meeting, Miss Coleman's apartment was ransacked, and she was hospitalized after what police reports described as a random mugging, language nearly identical to the initial reports about Ethan's assault. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone who threatened to expose the truth about Westside Heights faced swift and violent retribution. The operations center Richard had established in the safe house's converted garage hummed with activity as analysts pored over financial records and security personnel monitored surveillance feeds. Danielle, initially withdrawn in this unfamiliar environment, had gradually become an essential part of the investigation. Her first-hand knowledge of Westside Heights residents and the pattern of intimidation they had faced provided context that Richard's data analysts couldn't extract from spreadsheets and property records. These incidents weren't random, Danielle explained, pointing to a map where they had plotted reported accidents and crimes affecting Westside Heights residents. Notice how they cluster around the buildings that filed formal complaints about the redevelopment. Mrs. Jenkins, who organized the tenant association. Her apartment was the first to have electrical issues that made it uninhabitable. Mr. Guzman, who contacted the housing authority. His grandson was arrested on fabricated charges the next day. Richard nodded grimly. They're picking off the leaders first, isolating the most vulnerable. Their collaborative investigation hit an unexpected obstacle. When Elaine arrived at the safe house, her expression troubled as she requested a private conversation with her husband. The Foundation's annual audit has uncovered something concerning she began once they were alone. Our neighborhood revitalization grants have been flowing into shell companies connected to the Westside Heights development. Richard stared at her in disbelief. Your foundation is funding. This Elaine's hands trembled slightly as she handed him a folder, not intentionally. The grant proposals were for community improvements, affordable housing initiatives, workforce development, all the right buzzwords, all the right paperwork. But the money's being diverted. The Blake Family Foundation has been providing the veneer of legitimacy for the very displacement we claim to be fighting. The revelation struck Richard like a physical blow. Not only was his company involved in corrupt development practices, but his family's philanthropic efforts had been weaponized to facilitate them. The corruption wasn't limited to Victor Harmon. It had infected multiple institutions using their respectability as camouflage for exploitation. The scope of the conspiracy expanded further when Danielle, using her knowledge of hospital systems, helped Richard access medical records of Westside Heights residents who had reported similar accidents after protesting the development. A disturbing pattern emerged. Injuries consistent with assaults documented as falls or accidents, treatment notes that contradicted official reports, and in several cases, patients who reported threats mysteriously changing their stories after visits from insurance representatives. They're using every system designed to protect people as weapons against them. Danielle observed the resignation in her voice, suggesting this revelation confirmed long-held suspicions rather than shocking her. Armed with mounting evidence, Richard finally confronted Victor Harmon at Blake Tech headquarters, choosing a public setting to reduce the risk of another accident. The project manager's initial smugness dissolved as Richard methodically presented evidence of financial fraud, intimidation, and connection to organized violence. You think you're the first rich man to develop a conscience, Victor sneered when Richard finished. This isn't about conscience, Richard countered. It's about crime. You've been using my company to run a racketeering operation. Victor's laugh held genuine amusement. And who do you think approved the original strategy? Your board signed off on everything. The shell companies, the aggressive acquisition tactics, all of it. They just expected you to maintain your convenient ignorance. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mayor Thompson and Commissioner Davis are partners in this venture, Richard. The permits, the police cooperation, the expedited demolition approvals, none of that comes free. You push this, and it won't just be your company that suffers. Your reputation, your family, everything you've built will be collateral damage. As Richard left the meeting, his security team's urgent alert barely gave him time to clear the parking garage before his car exploded in a fireball of twisted metal and shattered glass. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer about business. It was war. What would you do if you discovered that systems meant to protect people were being used against them instead? Would you risk everything to fight for justice? Or would you protect yourself and your family first? Comment number 1. If you believe Richard should take the evidence public despite the dangers. Like this video if you think Zaria and Ethan's unexpected friendship will be the key to bringing down this corrupt system. And don't forget to subscribe to see how this battle between truth and power unfolds. The stakes couldn't be higher, as Richard and Danielle prepare to challenge not just corrupt individuals, but corrupt institutions. Will they find a way to break through the media blackout? Can they protect their children while fighting for an entire community? And just how deep does this conspiracy go? The next part of our story reveals the creative solution that comes the Plamasis Marises from the most unexpected source. The rejection email from the Oakwood Tribune landed in Richard's inbox with the predictable politeness of institutional cowardice. While we appreciate your concerns about the Westside Heights redevelopment, ongoing investigations prevent us from publishing potentially prejudicial material at this time. It was the fourth such response from major news outlets, each refusal wrapped in different language. But conveying the same message, powerful interests had closed ranks, and conventional media channels would not challenge the official narrative. Richard tossed his tablet onto the conference table with an uncharacteristic display of frustration. Around him, the team he'd assembled exchanged glances, but remained silent. The safe house had evolved into a war room over the past week, with security personnel, legal advisors, and data analysts working around the clock to build their case against what increasingly appeared to be a citywide corruption network. They're afraid, Danielle observed from her position near the digital map of Westside Heights, where she had been cataloging resident testimonies. The Tribune's parent company sits on 3 development boards with Mayor Thompson. Channel 4's owner plays golf with Commissioner Davis every Sunday. They won't bite the hands that feed them. Richard nodded grimly. The institutional power arrayed against them was daunting: media conglomerates, law enforcement, city government, and corporate interests, all interconnected through a web of financial relationships and mutual benefits. Alternative news platforms offered their only remaining option, but these smaller outlets lacked the credibility and reach needed to overcome the well-oiled PR machines already portraying Richard as unstable and vindictive following his son's assault. "We need to try a different approach," Ethan suggested from the doorway where he stood, with one arm still in a sling, his face bearing the fading evidence of his attack. Traditional media is compromised, but social media isn't controlled by the same gatekeepers. Before Richard could respond, Zaria slipped into the room behind Ethan, her presence in this strategy session unprecedented but somehow fitting given her central role in the unfolding events. "People believe stories from real people more than news reports anyway," she said with the simple clarity of a child who had grown up in the digital age. "My teacher, Miss Coleman, showed us how viral videos can change things when regular news won't talk about something." The room fell silent, as all eyes turned to the 6-year-old who had inadvertently sparked their unlikely alliance. "What are you suggesting?" Zaria Richard asked, his tone lacking the condescension adults often employed with children. "We should make videos of people telling what really happened," she replied without hesitation. "Not fancy with music and stuff. Just real people talking about what the bad men did to their homes and families." "Miss Coleman says authenticity is more powerful than production value." Danielle stared at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "When did you become a media strategist?" she asked with a slight smile. "Sunshine Center Media Literacy class," Zaria answered. "Mr. E taught us about digital citizenship." She glanced at Ethan, who nodded confirmation. The seed of an idea took root and rapidly blossomed. Within 48 hours, they had established a secure digital platform independent of existing social media giants, protected by encryption protocols that Richard's tech teams had originally developed for government contracts. Danielle, leveraging the trust she had built over years in the community, began reaching out to Westside Heights residents who had experienced intimidation firsthand. Initially, fear kept many silent, but Danielle's personal vouching for Richard's changed perspective and commitment to justice gradually overcame their hesitation. The first testimonial came from Mrs. Jenkins, the 74-year-old tenant association president, whose electrical accident had left her apartment uninhabitable. Seated in her daughter's crowded living room, where she now slept on a pull-out couch, she recounted with quiet dignity how utility workers had arrived unannounced, claiming to perform routine maintenance. 3 days later, a city inspector condemned her apartment of 42 years based on wiring issues that hadn't existed before the maintenance. When she filed a complaint, her grandson lost his job at a city-contracted landscaping company. The simplicity of her account, delivered without dramatics, but with unwavering certainty, carried more emotional impact than any polished news segment. More testimonials followed. Mr. 200www.com. Guzman describing his grandson's fabricated arrest. The Robinson family showing smartphone footage of hired thugs breaking their windows after they refused a below-market buyout offer. A former city clerk explaining how displacement complaints from Westside Heights were systematically misfiled under direct orders from the mayor's office. Each story built upon the last, creating a mosaic of corruption that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. Richard added financial context, using his insider knowledge to explain in accessible terms how the shell companies obscured the money trail and how the Blake Family Foundation had been manipulated into providing philanthropic cover for Playkitty. Predatory development. Zaria's instinct proved correct. The unvarnished testimonials shared through digital channels beyond traditional gatekeepers' control began gaining traction. Independent journalists picked up the story first, followed by international news outlets less beholden to local power structures. The response from the established order was swift and predictable. Mayor Thompson called a press conference, denouncing the manufactured controversy as the product of Richard Blake's mental instability following his son's assault. It's tragically common for trauma victims and their families to create elaborate narratives to make sense of random violence, the mayor stated, with practiced compassion. Mr. Bacon. Blake's accusations against respected community leaders represent a disturbed mind seeking targets for his understandable anger. Blake Tech's board members publicly distanced themselves from their founder, issuing a statement expressing concern for his well-being, while reassuring shareholders that the company's operations continued unaffected by his temporary leave of absence, a status Richard had never agreed to. The company's stock plummeted as investors responded to the uncertainty, wiping billions from its market capitalization in a single trading day. Local media amplified the official narrative, giving extensive coverage to psychologists who discussed post-traumatic stress and paranoia without ever examining Richard personally. Crime statistics were selectively presented to support the portrayal of Westside Heights as a high-crime area where violence like Ethan's assault occurred regularly. The racial undertones in this counter-offensive were obvious but effective with certain audiences, a wealthy white family blaming their misfortune on predominantly black and brown community leaders rather than accepting the dangers of an upper urban neighborhood. Ethan, watching this orchestrated character assassination from the safe house, made a decision without consulting his father. Using the secure platform they had established, he recorded a video from his hospital bed, his injuries still visible as he explained his volunteer work at the Sunshine Center and the systematic abuses he had witnessed. I started volunteering because I needed community service hours for college applications, he admitted with disarming honesty. I stayed because I met kids like Zaria, who deserved every opportunity I had been given without earning it. I discovered that the barriers facing these families weren't of their own making. They were deliberately constructed and maintained by people who profit from inequality, including unknowingly my own family. He detailed his discovery of financial documents during a tour of Blake Tech's development division, explaining how his questions about discrepancies between official community benefit claims and actual budget allocations had been dismissed. When I threatened to bring these documents to my father, Victor Harmon told me I was misinterpreting standard business practices. A week later, his son Cameron led the group that attacked me in Westside Heights. Ethan's testimony carried unique weight coming from someone who bridged both worlds. As the son of privilege who had chosen to engage with the community targeted for displacement, he undermined the narrative of us versus them that fueled public indifference to the plight of Westside Heights residents. His statement forced viewers to confront the humanity of those being displaced, rather than seeing them as abstract statistics or stereotypes. The digital campaign gained momentum, bypassing traditional media gatekeepers to reach audiences directly. An unexpected ally emerged when Judge Sandra Washington, no relation to Danielle, contacted Richard's legal team through secure channels. As the judge, who had rejected earlier complaints from Westside Heights residents, she had initially dismissed their claims as lacking evidence. Now, seeing the pattern emerge through multiple testimonials, she recognized the systemic nature of the injustice and offered legal pathways to expose the corruption through formal channels. "I've been on the bench for 17 years, she explained during a confidential meeting at the Safe House. In that time, I've seen patterns of case assignments that suddenly make sense in this context. Housing complaints from certain neighborhoods mysteriously end up before the same 3 judges, all with connections to development interests. When political pressure mounted against her, including threats of an ethics investigation for unrelated matters, Judge Washington made a bold move. Rather than bowing to intimidation, she publicly released evidence of previous attempts to influence her rulings on cases related to urban development, creating another crack in the facade of institutional integrity. As their campaign gained traction, Richard received word that Victor Harmon had fled the country, reportedly taking a consulting position with an international development firm beyond the reach of U.S. subpoenas. But more powerful figures remained entrenched, and their counterattack targeted the most vulnerable link in the alliance, Danielle Washington. Commissioner Davis ordered a deep background investigation, searching for any leverage to discredit her. They found it in a 20-year-old shoplifting charge from when Danielle was a teenager, struggling to support her sick mother with inadequate resources. Though the charge had been dismissed after community service, it became the centerpiece of a smear campaign portraying her as a career criminal, manipulating her daughter and Richard Blake for financial gain. The implication was clear. Zaria's involvement was coached, her testimony rehearsed, and her accidental discovery of Ethan, nothing more than a calculated ploy, orchestrated by a mother with a criminal history. The character assassination was sophisticated and relentless, playing on racial stereotypes while maintaining plausible deniability against accusations of racism. The battle for public opinion had escalated from disagreement to destruction, with the systems meant to inform and protect citizens now weaponized against those who challenged power. Yet with each escalation, more individuals within those systems began questioning their roles, creating hairline fractures in what had once seemed impenetrable institutional walls. Morning light filtered through the blinds of the Safe House kitchen as Danielle Washington prepared lunchboxes with the precise efficiency of a mother accustomed to stretching resources. Though the refrigerator contained more food than she typically purchased in a week, her habits of careful portion control and minimal waste persisted. The domestic routine provided a semblance of normalcy in circumstances that grew more surreal by the day. The relative calm shattered when Richard burst into the kitchen, his face ashen as he ended a call with his legal team. "They've issued an arrest warrant for you," he announced without preamble. Fraud charges related to allegedly filing false police reports about building conditions in Westside Heights. Danielle's hand stilled over the sandwich she'd been preparing, but her expression revealed resignation rather than surprise. "They're escalating," she observed with eerie calm. "The testimonials are gaining too much traction." Richard nodded grimly. "My attorneys are arranging for you to surrender voluntarily rather than risk a public arrest. They'll have bail ready." The practiced way, Danielle began removing her few personal items from the refrigerator and organizing Zaria's belongings spoke volumes about her life experience. This was not her first emergency evacuation, not her first system failure, not her first betrayal by institutions supposedly designed to protect citizens rather than power. What she couldn't possibly anticipate was the secondary attack that followed. When Danielle surrendered to authorities at the Oakwood County Courthouse accompanied by Richard's high-profile legal team, a representative from Child Protective Services waited in the wings with an emergency removal order for absentee Zaria. The document cited unstable living conditions and exposure to potentially criminal elements as justification for placing her in temporary foster care while her mother faced criminal charges. The legal maneuver's true purpose was transparent to everyone involved. Separating Zaria from both her mother and the Blake family would silence the most damaging witness to the corruption in Westside Heights. The system that had once privileged Richard now worked against him when he challenged its fundamental inequities. Despite his resources and connections, his attempts to secure emergency guardianship of Zaria while Danielle's case proceeded were denied by a judge with known ties to Mayor Thompson's re-election campaign. The girl was placed with a foster family on the opposite side of the city, effectively isolated from both her mother and the investigation team. Danielle's preliminary hearing transformed from routine legal procedure into media spectacle as community members from Westside Heights filled the courtroom in silent support. They arrived in church clothes, many taking unpaid time off work to bear witness, creating a visual statement that contradicted the narrative of a neighborhood beyond saving. Judge Sandra Washington, presiding despite political pressure to recuse herself, allowed evidence of the broader conspiracy to be entered into record over strenuous prosecution objections. The pattern of selective prosecution is directly relevant to establishing motive and context, she ruled, when the district attorney protested the defense's presentation of similar complaints that had received no criminal charges. This court will not artificially narrow its vision when viewing potentially connected events. While the legal battle unfolded in court, Elaine Blake leveraged her foundation connections to locate Zaria, discovering she had been placed with a foster family with direct ties to Commissioner Davis's church congregation. Using evidence of procedural violations in the emergency removal and documentation of safe, stable conditions at the secure residence where Zaria had been staying, Elaine secured an emergency hearing for temporary custody. The foster system, typically biased against placing children with families of different races, faced its own contradictions when a wealthy white family fought to care for a black child against the system's apparent preference for cultural compatibility in this specific case. Social media continued amplifying the story beyond local control with international coverage, forcing city officials to address the corruption allegations directly rather than through surrogates. The mayor and commissioner responded by doubling down, accusing Richard of orchestrating a corporate takeover of Westside Heights under the guise of helping residents, a claim undermined by Blake Tech's board having already removed him from operational control of the company. As public pressure mounted, cracks in the conspiracy widened. Anonymous whistleblowers from within Blake Tech, the police department, and City Hall began coming forward with documents supporting Richard and Danielle's claims. A mid-level accounting manager provided emails directing her to reclassify demolition expenses as community improvement costs eligible for tax credits. A police sergeant submitted body camera footage showing officers being instructed to ignore complaints from specific addresses in Westside Heights. A city planning intern revealed meeting notes where officials discussed the need to accelerate natural population migration through selective service reductions. The accumulated evidence painted a damning picture of institutional corruption, but the core financial connections remained elusive until Ethan, still recovering but determined to testify, provided the court with copies of the documents he probably had discovered before his attack. These records, which he had photographed with his phone before confronting Victor Harmon, contained the financial skeleton key that unlocked the entire conspiracy: detailed spreadsheets tracking payments from development entities to Shell, companies owned by the mayor-commissioner, and several judges disguised as consulting fees, but corresponding precisely with critical approval dates for the Westside Heights project. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at when I first found these documents. Ethan testified, his voice steady, despite his still-healing injuries. But I knew enough from my business classes to recognize that these payment patterns didn't make sense for legitimate consulting work. When I asked Mr. Harmon about the discrepancies, he dismissed my concerns. A week later, his son Cameron and two other boys cornered me near the Sunshine Center. As Ethan's evidence was presented, an unexpected development interrupted the proceedings. Federal agents entered the courtroom presenting Judge Washington with sealed warrants. The lead agent approached the bench, and after a brief conference, the judge addressed the stunned courtroom. This court is now in recess. These proceedings will continue at a date to be determined, as this matter has been incorporated into a federal investigation. The revelation that federal authorities had taken interest transformed the dynamics instantly. Local corruption could influence city courts, police departments, and media outlets, but federal jurisdiction operated beyond the reach of municipal power structures. Mayor Thompson and Commissioner Davis exited the courthouse to find news crews from national networks awaiting comment on the federal investigation, their previously secured media solidarity evaporating in the face of a bigger, more ratings-friendly scandal. Danielle, released on her own recognizance with all charges pending further review, emerged from the courthouse to thunderous applause from Westside Heights residents. The victory celebration was tempered, however, by the discovery awaiting them upon return to Danielle's apartment building. During her absence, the structure had been demolished, despite ongoing legal challenges, and without the required safety inspections or resident notifications. The mountain of rubble that had once been home to 27 families stood as a final act of retaliation, a reminder that even as justice began to turn in their favor, the physical reality of displacement remained. Danielle stared at the destruction, her arm around Zaria's shoulders, as the little girl processed the loss of everything familiar: her books, her drawings, the small treasures that constituted her world. "They think this will break us," Danielle said quietly. "They think our spirit lives in these walls." Zaria looked up at her mother, wisdom beyond her years in her steady gaze. "But it doesn't, does it, Mom? Our spirit is in us and in our community." Richard and Elaine Blake stood slightly apart, witnessing the moment with the uncomfortable awareness of their historical place on the other side of such devastation. "We can rebuild structures," Richard said finally. "What matters is that we're rebuilding trust and justice alongside them." Autumn leaves swirled across the construction site, where Blake Tech's luxury condominiums had once been planned, the blueprints now replaced with a radically different vision for Westside Heights. 3 months had transformed both the physical landscape and the power structures of Oakwood City. Mayor Thompson and Commissioner Davis faced federal indictments for racketeering, fraud, and civil rights violations, along with 7 Blake Tech executives who had facilitated the scheme. Victor Harmon remained abroad beyond the immediate reach of justice, but stripped of his assets through civil forfeiture proceedings. The demolition equipment that had once threatened Westside Heights now served reconstruction, as crews laid foundations for the Blake Washington Foundation's first major project, a mixed-income housing development prioritizing former residents for subsidized units. Richard Blake, no longer CEO of the company he had founded, directed operations from a modest site trailer, his designer suits replaced with more practical attire suited to a construction environment. The corporate boardroom's mahogany and leather had given way to folding tables and metal chairs, but the passion evident in his voice, as he reviewed plans with community representatives, suggested he considered this a promotion rather than a demotion. The commercial spaces along Magnolia Street need to prioritize locally owned businesses, Danielle Washington pointed out, indicating an area on the site plans. Corporate chains will drive up rents in surrounding properties and undermine the community ownership model. As the Foundation's newly appointed community liaison, Danielle, ensured resident voices remained central to all decisions. Her experience navigating systems designed to exclude her had become invaluable in redesigning those same systems to be more equitable. Agreed, Richard nodded, making notes. We'll structure the leases with rent controls and local hiring requirements. The transformation in their working relationship mirrored broader changes in their understanding of power and privilege. What had begun as tragedy and suspicion had evolved into a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose, though not without ongoing challenges and uncomfortable realizations. Outside the trailer, Ethan supervised a group of teenagers installing a community garden that would eventually supply fresh produce to neighborhood residents. His physical recovery had progressed steadily, though occasional headaches and sensitivity to bright light persisted as reminders of the attack. The psychological healing had taken a different path as he processed both the violence he had experienced and his growing awareness of his own privileged position in a deeply unequal system. The tomato plants need more support. Zaria instructed seriously, her clipboard almost comically large against her small frame as she checked items off a list. At 7 years old now, she had appointed herself assistant garden manager, a position Ethan and the other volunteers respected without condescension. The unique bond between them had deepened through shared trauma and recovery, creating a bridge between worlds previously separated by design rather than circumstance. Zaria's exceptional intelligence, recognized by educators who now actively sought to nurture her potential rather than simply manage her presence in overcrowded classrooms, had earned her a scholarship to Oakwood Academy, not as charity, but as acknowledgement of abilities that might have gone undeveloped in a system that routinely overlooked children from her neighborhood. The Blake Washington Foundation had emerged from the corruption scandal with a mission that extended beyond physical reconstruction. Its educational initiatives partnered with local schools to provide resources without imposing external control. Its legal advocacy program supported residents facing displacement in other neighborhoods, and its business incubator offered capital and mentorship to entrepreneurs from historically marginalized communities. These efforts faced ongoing resistance from entrenched interests. Richard and Elaine encountered cold shoulders from former social allies who saw their new priorities as betrayal of class interests. Business relationships cultivated over decades dissolved as partners questioned whether the Blakes had become political, the term used when wealth challenged rather than reinforced existing power structures. Yet for every door that closed, new ones opened with individuals and organizations committed to genuine change rather than preserving the status quo. The Foundation's work attracted talented professionals who sought purpose alongside compensation, creating an organization that reflected the diversity of the communities it served rather than merely claiming to serve diverse communities. Danielle's leadership role acknowledged the expertise that came from lived experience, valuing her insights as equal to the credentials of academically trained staff. The balance wasn't always perfect, and tensions occasionally flared when implicit biases surfaced, or when good intentions outpaced cultural understanding. These moments, once suppressed beneath political correctness or avoided entirely through segregated lives, now became opportunities for authentic growth and recalibration. The story culminated in the opening ceremony for the community center that replaced the originally planned luxury retail space. Residents of all ages gathered on folding chairs beneath a banner proclaiming Westside Heights' rising building community together. Local musicians provided entertainment, while children explored the new playground equipment installed through a participatory design process that had incorporated their ideas. As the official ceremony began, Richard took the podium briefly, acknowledging the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 months ago, I stood on this spot with very different plans and a profound ignorance of the community that called this neighborhood home. Today, I stand here humbled by the resilience, wisdom, and generosity of spirit I've witnessed in Westside Heights, qualities I failed to see when viewing this community through spreadsheets and property values. He introduced Danielle, whose speech emphasized continuity rather than disruption. This neighborhood has always been rich in what matters most: neighbors who look out for each other, elders who carry our history, and children who represent our future. What's changing today isn't who we are, but whether that identity is recognized and respected by systems that previously sought to erase us. When Zaria stepped forward to cut the ceremonial ribbon, a ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. The smallest figure on the stage had become a symbol of the unexpected connections that could transform communities when artificial barriers fell. Just before the ribbon cutting, Zaria spotted a distinctive black sedan at the periphery of the crowd. Inside sat a man whose profile she recognized instantly, Victor Harmon, apparently risking a return to witness the dismantling of his corrupt enterprise. Before security could react, the vehicle disappeared down a side street. A reminder that while systems could begin to change, the individuals who profited from inequality rarely surrendered their advantage completely. The moment passed without disrupting the celebration, but its significance lingered, as a realistic acknowledgement that justice remained an ongoing process rather than a single victorious moment. As the community center doors officially opened and residents explored the new facilities, Zaria sat between Danielle and Richard on the stage, symbolically bridging worlds previously kept separate through deliberate policy and practice. Her simple act of compassion months earlier had revealed not just an injured boy, but the injured systems that allowed such disparities to exist. The phone call that began with fear concluded a story of transformation, not just for the individuals involved, but for an entire community learning that justice requires both courage and connection across the artificial boundaries of race and class. What would you do if you witnessed injustice in your community? Would you have the courage to speak up like Zaria did, or would you look the other way? This story reminds us that real change often begins with the smallest voices. If you found this story meaningful, please comment below with one action you could take to address inequality in your own community. Don't forget to like this video. If you believe in the power of unexpected connections to transform lives, subscribe for more stories that challenge us to see beyond our assumptions, and share with someone who needs to be reminded that compassion can change everything. Thank you for joining me on this journey through A Black Girl Calls a Billionaire. Because sometimes the most important calls we make are the ones that force us to answer difficult questions about justice, privilege, and our responsibility to each other. This story reminds us that systemic inequality persists not through open hatred, but through complex institutional arrangements that benefit those with power while remaining invisible to them. Richard Blake didn't actively choose to harm Westside Heights residents. His privilege allowed him to remain unaware of how his company's actions affected real lives. His journey shows that accountability requires moving beyond guilt into action, using privilege to dismantle the very systems that created it. For Danielle Washington, survival had always meant keeping her head down and distrusting powerful institutions that repeatedly failed her community. Her courage to eventually trust and collaborate across social divides demonstrates that effective change requires both insider knowledge and outsider resources. 6-year-old Zaria's compassion becomes the catalyst for transformation, proving that our smallest actions can trigger profound change when we choose humanity over fear. The story illustrates how racism operates not just through individual prejudice, but through interconnected systems, housing, education, healthcare, law enforcement, and media, that maintain inequality even without overtly racist intentions. True justice requires recognizing these connections and rebuilding with accountability authentic relationships and shared power. The most meaningful changes begin with unlikely alliances formed across artificial boundaries, guided by the moral clarity that sometimes only children possess. What would you do if you discovered that systems you've benefited from your entire life were causing harm to others? Would you have the courage to use your privilege to challenge those systems like Richard did, or would you look away to protect your comfort? Have you ever witnessed discrimination but stayed silent because speaking up seemed too risky? Comment below with a time when you stood up against injustice or wish you had. Your story might inspire someone else to find their courage. If you believe that unexpected connections between people from different worlds can transform communities, hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge us to see beyond our assumptions and recognize our shared humanity. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how systemic inequality works. Sometimes the most important conversations start with a simple story. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember that compassion, like Zaria's simple phone call, can set in motion changes far greater than we imagine. Until next time, keep looking for opportunities to build bridges across divides. You never know whose life you might transform, including your own.